Sweet Mother Michigan, Father Superior, coming down from Mackinac and Sault Ste. Marie. Blue water Huron rolls down to Lake Erie, falls into Ontario and runs on out to sea. The Great Lakes are a dying.
You have come upon the Great Lakes Guys podcast. The podcast features not only the history, geography, and geology of the land, waters, and people of the Great Lakes Basin, but as well we interview talented people from around the region who form the innovative cultural web of music, arts, technology, and science of the Great Lakes Basin. And before getting to the podcast interview, we would like to thank Lee Murdoch, the Great Lakes balladeer, who allowed us to use his recording of the song The Great Lakes Song. The Great Lakes Song was originally composed by Pat Daly, another prominent balladeer of the Great Lakes. Today we are going to interview, for a second time, the historian Karl Schmid. This interview is the fourth in a series of 4 interviews regarding the history of the Willow Run Bomber Plant, located near Ypsilanti, Michigan during World War II. The first 3 interviews you can find on our website, thegreatlakesguys.org. Karl is a historian at the Michigan Flight Museum, located on the grounds of the present-day Willow Run Airport. He is an expert in the history of the Willow Run Bomber Plant during World War II, where thousands of the massive B-24 bombers were manufactured for the war effort. Karl knows his history well. He knows what are the legends and what is probably the truth about the plant and its many storied characters. In this interview, we will cover the history of the bomber plant from its construction through to the end of the war. Okay, people, today we're at the second interview with Karl Schmid, a historian at the Michigan Flight Museum here in Ypsilanti, Michigan, at the Willow Run Airport. And today we're going to pick up where we had left off on our first interview, just as the Willow Run Airport was getting off the ground. And so we're going to go through the history of the airport through the war, how the manufacturing was ramped up, all the problems that they encountered with trying to build this very complicated machine in record time and record numbers. So we'll deal with some of the politics, some of the engineering issues, some of the people issues, some of the political issues. We're going to try to get into all that, and it's a very intriguing story. So Karl's going to introduce himself, tell us a little bit about himself, and then we'll get right into the facts of the matter.
Great.
Okay, Karl?
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been enjoyable, and I hope to have a little bit more fun today. I am a docent here at the Michigan Flight Museum. I've been doing that for about 4 years, and prior to that, I had a career in law enforcement and retired a number of years ago to do this. And part of my background is I did complete a master's program in World War II studies through Arizona State and the World War II Museum in New Orleans. Coming out here to the museum, I was very fortunate to pick up where I left off on that and can just jump into the Willow Run Bomber Plant and the local history that provides.
Okay, so Karl, I think we more or less let off at the last time. What was the guy, the Ford engineer that went out to California there? What was his name?
Yeah, Charlie Sorensen.
Sorensen, yeah. Sorensen just basically he wowed the government on this plan he had for manufacturing the airplane. So if we can kind of backtrack just a little bit and talk about what happened there and that the fact that I think the government gave Ford a $200 million contract. Is that it at the time? Or
yeah, it's a little bit more interesting when you add in the fact that the Fords actually started building the factory here at Willow Run before they ever had a signed contract. The first week of 1941, January 41, Edsel cast iron, Charlie Sorensen and some family members and some engineers go out to San Diego and they watch production of Consolidated's B-24 Liberator bomber, realizing that the production methods out there were very antiquated and very pedantic, very slow. So without pulling out their hair, Sorensen and Edsel kind of realize and talk about how if they brought that back to Michigan, created a brand new plant, and wound up using things that they learned from the auto industry building cars. They use it to build airplanes instead. They could greatly increase the efficiency and also the productivity of building bombers. In that vein, again, first part of January, there's some news stories and some announcements that come out that Ford is going to suddenly get into the bomber business. And in that, Edsel and Sorensen publicly declare that they feel they can build a bomber an hour and bring those off the assembly line for at the time, the looming war. We're still not in the war yet. It's about 12 months off. But they publicly state that Ford can build bombers faster and better than anyone else.
Okay, which seems to me a very, how should I say, ballsy, ballsy claim, right?
It really was. And considering that Ford had not been producing airplanes for more than a decade, and the ones that they did build back in the late 20s, they only produced about 200 of them. And now you're talking about that many a week or that many a month. It was an incredibly boastful, big thing for them to proclaim.
So, but what might have led to their confidence in that claim?
I think Edsel and, again, Sorensen is the looming figure in this. I think they, in their minds, look at the assembly process of a Model T, let's say, and realize that when you're talking about a B-24 Liberator, it's roughly the same idea in that you're stamping out the parts, you're having people put them together, and a moving assembly line is going to make that more efficient. However, a car, depending on the model, depending on the technology and what year, a car has maybe 10,000, 12,000 parts to it, individual parts when you break it down, and all the nuts and bolts and the fenders and the engine and all that. A B-24 Liberator, we find, has about 1.2 million different parts to it. So yes, you're ramping up what you're building and the scale of it, but then you add in the fact that Ford and their people were not experts in aviation and in building planes. So yeah, a way to put it is that they bit off more than they could chew initially. And I think it's a little unfair, the criticism of them. And we find as 1941 ends and 42 begins, the government, President Roosevelt, everyone starts screaming, where are our bombers? Because by early 42, obviously, we are now in the war, and now we actually need these. It's not a matter of supplying our allies anymore. It's a matter of putting war weapons in the hands of Americans to take the fight to Japan and to Nazi Germany. So it was doable, and it certainly was done. I think they just had, Edsel and Sorensen just had the fault of being boastful and maybe thinking that they were better than they were. It just took a while for everything to catch up with their big vision.
So, but they must have. Did they have some idea of the incredible number of parts? I know you said there's a lot of parts, but somebody has to make those parts. So
absolutely.
So did they at that time know that somebody could make those parts and get them into the factory?
Yes, and when they tour the plant out in San Diego, the initial idea was that Consolidated Aircraft Company wanted Ford to stamp out the parts for them to essentially become a supplier, ship those parts across country, and then Consolidated would continue building airplanes. Edsel and Sorensen said, no, absolutely not. We're going to do it. We're going to do it all, or we're not going to do it at all. And within that plant that eventually comes up in the fields out here, it is two plants in one. At the beginning of the plant, the first parts of it, they are stamping out and making their own parts, rivets, wings, the fuselages. They're doing all of that. And then the second part of the plant, they are assembling it to the point where when it is done and it comes off the assembly line, it's ready to fly and be taken to wherever it's needed. So that was also an issue because a lot of Consolidated parts were brought in from other places. They had contractors that were building and stamping out the parts. That leads to sometimes shortages. That leads to sometimes if there's a change in what's being made, you have to communicate it to the person that's your supplier, wherever that is. So that also kind of strung out the chain and made it a little bit harder. So we're going to build it here in our plant. We're going to do all of it because at the Rouge plant at Highland Park, that is what they did essentially for cars. So of course we can do that for planes. It just wasn't that simple.
So somebody had to design this huge factory, I guess, which at the time turned out to be the largest factory in the world. Is that correct?
That is very correct.
Right. So how did they plan for that? How did they get the conception of this is the amount of space I need, and how long the assembly line had to be, and those kinds of issues?
It was an issue, but in that issue, it also turned out to be one of the stronger things that happened. Some other plants and different factories and things like that, if you're coming up with different automobile models and things, you're already working in a confined space as to what you already have, a pre-existing building. In this case, they kind of reverse engineered it. Seeing the plant out in San Diego, kind of also enlarging it in their head, they drew out and sketched what they wanted it to be, and then they took those things. Again, Sorensen, people will be tired of hearing his name, but Sorensen looms large and all this. He takes that, and then they hire an architect to do it, and so you're kind of working in a good way. You're working backwards. So we know what we want, and we're going to have it designed to meet our needs and not the other way around. As far as the land goes, the property out here was about 1,700 acres, and that was not an issue. As they had plenty of room. They wind up using about 80 acres for the physical plant itself and some of the surrounding buildings, and then another 1,400 acres winds up being the airport, which again is still out here. They hire a very famous architect, a man named Albert Kahn, and it's somebody that Ford had worked with before on other buildings and other things for them. He is incredibly famous. A number of buildings downtown Detroit, including the Fisher Building and some other ones, were designed by Kahn. You go to the campus of the University of Michigan, a number of buildings there were designed by Kahn, incling the Hill Auditorium, very famous concert.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Very famous concert venue.
Yeah, sure.
Kahn designed and had a hand in building those. He and his company also designed in the 30s a number of Russian factories out in Moscow that turned into be war factories as the war went on. So Kahn was a very well-known person. Turns out that that was pretty much the last building that he ever designed. Mm-hmm. Kahn dies in 1942, and Willow Run was kind of his end masterpiece. But the idea was to fit all of that in there, that what they needed to do, build or manufacture the parts on one end and then build the planes on the other. The factory was over a mile long, and in different parts of the factory, it was also about a quarter of a mile wide. And if you think about it in just kind of a north and south type of thing, the body of the factory runs east and west.
Yes.
And then at the west end, the beginning of the plant, there's kind of an inlet, there's the administration buildings, and there's also kind of an intake up that way and on that end of the factory where parts and other things, materials are brought in. Goes from west to east as the planes are being built, west to east. And then at the easternmost end of the building, there's now like a south, an outlet. The building continues south a little bit, and that's where the planes eventually will emerge and then take off from there.
That's the famous right turn at the end.
It is. And this is where I'm going to break some hearts and maybe destroy some preconceived notions. As the 1941 starts, and now Edsel is pretty sure they're going to have the contract to build the planes. Nothing is signed yet, but they believe it's going to happen because the federal government had already been on Ford, begging them to build something. So now this is kind of up in the air. It's going to happen. They're negotiating some things. So Edsel realizes it's going to happen. So let's just get to it. He has to go convince his father that they're going to use this farm out in the middle of nowhere to build this factory. Takes a lot of arm twisting. Finally, Henry Ford gives in, says, yes, you can use it, and then they start. So Kahn is developing and designing. Henry's getting his arm twisted by Edsel. There's no contracts yet, but what happens is, and this is the well-known legend, one of the provisos that Henry Ford demanded in order to give up the land for the factory. Today, if you walk across Willow Run Airport, you're going to go from, if you're going east to west, you'll walk from Wayne County into Washtenaw County. The airport and the property out here straddles two counties. There's no sign, but it's out there, and you do that. The legend is that Henry Ford demanded that the factory be totally within Washtenaw County and none of it leaking over the line into Wayne County. It was alleged that he claimed, or it's just, again, this is part of the legend, but back in the 1930s, Washtenaw County was considered a conservative Republican stronghold. In the national elections in 32, 36, and 40, the majority of people in Washtenaw County voted for the Republican candidates. They were all very sad because each one of those years FDR wins handily in the United States, but Washtenaw County is considered a Republican stronghold, which also kind of flips the script for today, with Ann Arbor being the largest city, Ann Arbor the liberal bastion, the university, and all that. Yeah. So Henry wanted any business in Washtenaw County and not Wayne County. He had to deal with Wayne County for Rouge and Highland Park, but he didn't want it this way. And therefore, he demanded it be to the west. However, we find out much later, and as far as the factory goes. So, I'm sorry. Kahn designs the factory. In order to keep it within Washtenaw County, at the very end, before the planes are finished, they put in a 90-degree turn, and there are many pictures that show on the floor, in two places, there are two giant turntables that the planes are towed onto. There would have been going east. They put on the turntables, turned, and then they come south, and that's how they finish up as they're completed. The county line was right there. The reality is, when you take a bigger look at it, is when the airport goes in and all the taxiways and all the associated spots out there, had the factory continued east and had the people finished the planes and gone straight out, the completed planes, which had not been tested, which weren't ready for flight, would have gone right out onto the flight line.
Yeah. So
the geography actually affects the way the plant is built considerably more than the politics.
Oh,
but politics is fun, and it's a great story.
It's a great story.
And like I said, you can absolutely see Henry Ford pounding the desk saying it won't be in Wayne County, it won't be in Wayne County, I want it over here. That absolutely would have been logical, would have made sense. At the time, there's also another rumor going around that Wayne County will charge the Ford Motor Company a tax per completed plane, and numbers have been bandied about, but the one I've read most often is about $800. So Ford is building these planes, yet the county is going to tax them $800 per plane if it is in Wayne County. So in addition to maybe a little bit of Henry's madness, he's a businessman. He did not bank all those billions by being dumb. Yeah. So if he can keep it in Washtenaw County, allegedly, he doesn't have to deal with them taxing the planes.
Well, $800 is not an insignificant amount of money back then.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? Yeah, you know.
In the very end, there's over 8,000 planes made.
Yeah.
So that would have been a sizable chunk of money. So yes, the legend is sometimes not as fun as the truth. And maybe we can mix and match a little bit, but the physical nature of how the plant was laid out, plus the requirements for the airport, tend to skew the argument more towards a necessity of putting the turntables in and making a 90-degree turn. But I'm happy to go either way. If people want to die on that hill, that's fine, as to how the museum was designed.
So how long did it take to construct that factory?
It was actually a little over a year, and the interesting part is even a little bit longer than that. But they built from west to east, which made sense, and also they actually started stamping out parts for planes before the factory was actually even finished. So that allowed them to do that. They were behind. It took more than a year. They thought that the plant would be done in exactly a year, and the day after the plant's completely finished, they're going to start rolling out completed airplanes. It doesn't happen that way. That's when a lot of talk happens. That's when Willow Run gets the nickname of Will It Run because of the delays, and then the government steps in and starts asking and demanding, we gave you all this money, where are our planes? But even before that, ground is broken at the factory officially April 18th, 1941, which 1 year later to the day is when the Doolittle raid happened, also on April 18th. And if you're a Revolutionary War buff, that was also when Paul Revere made his famous ride. April 18th in our history has got a few things of note to that. Ground is broken, and so they're cutting down the trees. They've got road graders, bulldozers, and everything else out there trying to level it, trying to start construction. That happens, and things are ramping up. The contract eventually is signed with the federal government, and originally it was going to be a lot smaller. The number was around $200 million. The contract that they do sign is for $400 million, and that includes what being manufactured, put together, what were known as knockdown kits. That was something else, and it kind of goes a little bit to what the folks in San Diego were hoping for, but with a little bit of a twist. Because of Ford's experience building airplanes, the idea was that Ford would produce all the parts to build the individual airplanes and then put them on very large trucks and then ship them to a factory that had experience building them. So Ford's going to be a gigantic supplier of airplanes. And in this case, the ones that got it was about 1,800 knockdown kits that were made. Those go to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to a Douglas subsidiary out there, and those aircraft from the kits are produced by the people in Tulsa. Mm-hmm. Interesting note there, the factory that happened in is still there. It is actually still an active factory. The people of Tulsa are kind of proud of that. They are now building school buses in part of that factory, and then in another part of the factory, they are a subcontractor for Boeing parts for the F-18 Hornet. So Tulsa still has quite a bit of experience and quite a bit of history in airplane building. So they're going to truck these kits out there. And Ford went so far as to design and build a semi-truck and trailer to do this. They built about 95 of these trucks. They're just an enormous semi-truck that these kits will fit on. And then they just start day and night shipping the completed kits out to Tulsa to have them assembled there.
But did they have the roads to haul that kind of stuff out?
Not exactly, no. That was another part. Infrastructure in the 30s and now 40s was horrible. Yeah. We have to wait for President Eisenhower to start working on the highway system. But they got them there. If you go to Tulsa, as I said, they have a wonderful museum there that talks about the assembly of these airplanes and the semi-trucks that took them there and that. They got them there, but I too can see them driving down like one-lane dirt roads, this enormous semi. It was quite a thing. It was quite a production.
So did the Consolidated Company, did they feel a little miffed because they got kind of just, pushed aside or not?
They continue to build planes, and I've seen some pictures that show that I think they cleaned up their act a little bit in that they kind of came into the 20th century on production methods. They do kind of go to more of a, not necessarily assembly line in the sense of what Willow Run was, but they do start taking the hint and start building some efficiently. At the end of the war, they wind up building other aircraft, and they had a number of other products, but they are no longer building the B-24 when World War II ends. Uh-huh. During the war, 5 different plants in the United States are building B-24s, and we include San Diego, the people in Tulsa, and then 2 plants in Texas outside of Dallas, and then Willow Run being the 5th one. When the war ends, Willow Run is the only plant that's still making the B-24. Uh-huh. A lot of that has to do with the efficiency, with the fact that in 1944, 1945, the other plants had been given different planes to make, and it was clear that the planes coming out of Willow Run of that were the better of the B-24s being produced.
I see. So how did this assembly line work? They didn't have conveyor belts, right? Did they pull the parts along? Is that what they did?
In some spots there were conveyor belt type things, but not what we would think of in the automotive industry. Yeah. You see black and white footage of them building Model Ts, and the whole body of the car or truck is on that moving along. Not exactly. The B-24 is such a big piece of machinery that was not that feasible. Yes, within the factory they had a number of tractors. They called them tugs, but Ford built tugs are pulling the after the wheels are on, are pulling them across through the assembly process. Lots of cranes. They had one of the beauties of the design was that they were able to understand they were going to need large overhead cranes. So the factory was built with that in mind, and they were built up in the rafters so they could move these giant hulking machines through the factory as they're being built.
So they sort of hung from the ceiling, is what you're saying? Is
No. Well, actually, one of the other designs that Sorensen had in mind was to have the whole plane hanging like that, but then they would have had to have the factory several stories higher.
Oh.
So no, they weren't actually hanging from the cranes. The cranes were moving them from spot to spot.
I see.
The other bonus and the other method that was used as far as the plane construction was the different parts of the plane were in the spots that they were needed. Backing up a little bit, another thing that was done differently as far as assembly of Ford Liberators is they broke the plane down into 5 different components, and that was very useful and very good for the assembly process. One of them being the tail. Another one would be the cockpit or the front part of the fuselage. Another part is the rear part of the fuselage to the tail. The wingtips are another one, and then the big one was the center wing. Center wing was to have it as strong and sturdy plane as possible to carry all of that weight. The center wing was one giant piece, and the machine that was built to build those and to fabricate it that way cost $250,000 just for the machine to build that part of the plane. So that is a way to put these together by using each individual part. And if you have a second, I'm going to ruin another legend as far as the Liberators. It's been printed and spoken infinitely that the bomber plant built a B-24 every hour. That has kind of morphed into, and you'll also see different numbers. I've heard 55 minutes, I've heard 63 minutes, 60 minutes, 60. So I tend to say I use just a rounded of 1 hour.
Yeah.
Minutes. Many people have come to take that and think that a pile of indistinguishable parts, those 1.2 million parts that I spoke about, you take a pile of the pieces and then in 1 hour you have a brand new plane and out the door you go. That's not what happened.
Yeah.
That wasn't feasible. It's not physically possible. As an example to someone who brought that up, and I was talking to them, B-24 Liberator has about 360,000 individual rivets in its construction, holding it together. And each one of those was put in by hand and by a Rosie or a Ralph the Riveter. There were plenty of them.
There was Ralph the Riveter.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it's another myth. You did not have to be named Rosie to work in the factory. So to put in 360,000 rivets in 60 minutes. I got my calculator out one day. That equals about one rivet about every thousandth of a second. So that wasn't actually possible. It wasn't physically possible, even by today's standards, with automation and robots and things like that. You couldn't do it. The better way to say it, and what I've tried to communicate and get to people, they finished 1 an hour.
Yeah.
And that wasn't even, stopwatch wise. These numbers actually came from monthly statistics. So they would figure out, in this month we made 400, and at the height, the capacity of building them, we made 600 in this particular month. You break that down, and then you do the division there, and then yes, it turns out that they were completing 1 an hour.
Yeah.
But yes, unfortunately, there are many people that think that it took exactly 1 hour to build this plane and get it out the hangar door. So wasn't the case. And with the different staging of the different parts of the airplane, they would be building. If you're Rosie, you're building one tail after another. And that's what you're doing, and that was also a kind of an innovation from the automotive industry, is that you know the tail of the plane, and that's all you do. So you finished 10, 15 tails in one day, you put them off to the side, and then you come in the next day and you make a bunch more. So the idea was that you slowly funneled these pre-assembled pieces into one plane, and that took usually between a week and a half if you could follow it from an individual piece up till it flew out the front door. So that is It's probably nitpicking from a nerd like me, but that does kind of explain a little bit better that it took a while to build these planes.
So I think you mentioned they had like 5 different stages that they built the plane in. So did they have like input ports into the side of the building where they fed material for those different stages?
There were things on the side, but again, primarily the front of the factory, things entered there, and then once you made it within the factory, so the pieces of the tail are already in the factory, and where you stamp them out and then rivet them together, so then they're just moved along to the next spot where you need them. So yeah, there were things brought in. As an example, the engines for the Liberator were not made here. The tires were not made here. The machine guns were brought in. The top turrets were made by another manufacturer. I've seen different numbers on that as well, like 80% plus of the airplane was made on site, including all the rivets, all of the body parts. The instruments were also made somewhere else that eventually go in there, as were the bomb sites. By and large, though, still, the majority of the plane is produced under one roof, and it was very efficient that way.
I think I heard that those bomb sites were under pretty tight security. Is that?
That is true. That is a true story. The B-24 featured the Norden bomb site, and we have a number of photographs towards the end of the assembly process. After the plane has already made its famous 90-degree turn, there was a vault, and it was rumored that an armed Army guard was there 24 hours a day protecting that vault and keeping that secret. And when, at the very last second, the plane was ready to receive its site, someone would go to the vault, open it, take that bomb site out, walk it over to the plane, and put it in under the scrutiny of an armed military guard.
So, where was the bomb site made?
Norden had their headquarters and some of their production in the state of New York.
I see. So what was the novelty about that bomb site that made it so secret?
That's a great question. I am not smart enough as far as what the machine itself did, but it was novel in that you put in your airspeed, you put in your altitude, and the little, at the time, computer inside would figure out what speed and what altitude that you needed to be at to hit your target. And then it came up with the coordinates, and the guy looking into it was the lead, the bombardier in that particular airplane, and it told them when to do it. There was also a system within that the plane would be flown by the bombardier for about 60 seconds, 90 seconds while they are near the target and getting to the target.
Oh, I didn't know that either. Wow. Okay.
I think it's in some movies or in books or something. You'll hear the pilot talk about, to the bombardier, the plane is yours, that kind of a thing. Yeah. That was an early tactic. What they found later was that it made more sense to have like a lead bomber in a formation. You have 100 planes, 200 planes in a squadron or whatever you sent that day. And then the lead bomber would figure out when to drop the bombs. And then the trailing and the side bombers would just kind of go with, once he drops his bombs, we're going to drop ours.
Yeah, loaded everything.
And that also goes to the idea of very specific strategic bombing. When the war started, we thought we would be able to put a 500-pound bomb exactly where we wanted it. Turns out that was not remotely close to what happened. It was just not that accurate, and we thought we were going to bomb a very specific part of a very specific building. The reality was, and the British figured this out before we did, but the better strategy was to bomb an area and hope that some of your bombs fell on that factory, on that military target, or whatever you were going for.
But then it got a lot of civilians. I mean, I think the Allies said, well, they're not going after civilians right in the beginning, but then in the end, it was kind of like, well, that's what's
that absolutely did happen. Many civilians in Europe lost their lives from strategic bombing, and again, our British friends, they had suffered at the hands of the Nazis and V-1 rockets, V-2 rockets. From middle to the end of the war, the Brits really stopped trying to bomb particular targets, and they stopped caring about bombing particular targets. They would just do what later became known as carpet bombing. The British would just bomb an area almost into desolation, and that was their strategy, hoping that maybe a war factory was in that area. But again, the British, they became less, they didn't care.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So let's go back a little bit and say, okay, what's going on with the Ford family now? I mean, I think there was, Edsel Ford had health issues, right?
Absolutely.
And he had conflicts with his father until his father died, I guess. And then there was Harry Bennett, right? Was kind of always in and out of the picture there. So can you fill us in on, what was going on behind the scenes there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, we addressed it a little bit earlier that Henry and Edsel loved each other, father-son. Son absolutely idolized his dad and what his dad contributed to the world and all that. However, they had vastly different ideas about what to do with the company, what to do once the war started. So again, we're still in we're in 41. The plant is now rising up out in the former farm, and you can say that Sorensen winds up being out at that factory more than Bennett. Harry Bennett is still around. Harry Bennett is Henry Ford's doing his dirty work. Whatever he wants done needs to be done. So he's out there, he's handling some of it, but a lot of the time it said he stayed more back at the Rouge plant and handled that. And the other Ford plants I should have mentioned before, they got different government contracts. By the end of the war, the Ford Motor Company had between $4 and $5 billion in government contracts to produce all kinds of things. In addition to the complete B-24, they also produced Jeeps. We think of the Willys company down in Toledo as producing Jeeps. They in Toledo made about 300,000 Jeeps. Ford Motor Company made about 100,000 Jeeps. They also made wooden gliders to transport troops from using their forests and their wood stock from up north. They make the gliders. They also make just tens of thousands of radial engines for various fighters. So the other Ford factories are producing war material, but Willow Run is a little bit isolated, both physically and I think because that was kind of Edsel's baby. Edsel came up with it and is going to see it through to the end, but it turns out to his end. Edsel had what probably was stomach cancer, and it started affecting him in 40, 41. There were a number of incidents where he winds up getting hospitalized, and then he just lives on coffee and 4 hours of sleep for a couple years. It's safe to say that the Willow Run plant exacerbated his death. It was just because he was going to get it done. He was going to do it no matter what. And he passes away in May of 1943. Sad part of that, in addition to him passing, was the fact that the factory was not quite yet where it needed to be at the time of his passing. So the glory of the Bomber Hour, the glory of the plant receiving awards from the Army and Navy for efficiency and for production, Edsel never lives to see any of it. By then, his son, Henry II, has been brought back from naval service. He was in the Navy, and the other son, Benson, I believe was in the Army. Both of them are brought back just before his death, by order of the Secretary of the Navy. Sorensen and some others basically appealed to him saying, look, we need these kids back. I believe Henry II was 23, 24, so he wasn't a kid by any stretch of the imagination. But he came back in time to see his dad at the end. And once his dad passes away, the word was he kind of wandered around the plants in a daze, trying to figure out what do I do, what needs to be done. And then there's an internal struggle at Ford. Harry Bennett wants to run everything. Henry, after losing his son, Henry thinks, well, I'm going to have to be president again. So he's going to step up and he's going to get back into the day-to-day operation of the Ford Motor Company. He was in no condition to do any of those things. He would constantly call his secretary and summoning people that hadn't worked for him for 20 years. He would forget things. He'd have conversations with people that weren't there. So that was a problem. Henry II, is trying to figure out what's his role and who can he trust. His father had left him some cryptic notes and told him some things about this person at this factory and this person at that can help you. Look to them for guidance. Henry II's also figuring out what's happening after the war. So yeah, there's quite a bit of turmoil, quite a bit of upheaval in the company. But the one constant is trying to get Willow Run to run and to run properly and to see that through.
So, so let's talk about a little bit what's going on in Detroit during this time, during the war.
So now December 7th, 1941, obviously occurs, and that changes everything. The speed was one of the things that President Roosevelt would send telegraphs to some of the auto execs, telling them, we need things, let's get going. There is patriotism. There is a sense of shock. Most Americans probably couldn't have found Hawaii on a map or the Philippines, and yet the Empire of Japan suddenly attacks us. 2,300 Americans are dead. The fleet's in shambles. So that was a huge wake-up call. And luckily, it doesn't get a lot of play, but luckily the mobilization had already started. The Selective Service Act had started around the same time as the factory was going up, April, May of 41. It's also the same time that we had started with the Lend-Lease program to our allies. But now we're in it. We're in the war. I've been critical of Henry Ford, but I have to stop and say this. A day or two after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Henry Ford sends President Roosevelt a telegram saying, "Dear sir, we are now all in this together. Please let me know what you need us to do. We're behind you 100%. God bless you. God bless the United States. Let's go. We're gonna win the war." Something to that effect, but basically kind of burying the hatchet and saying that, bygones be bygones. Let's just go do it.
Well, I didn't know Henry Ford did that.
Yeah, that was a neat thing. It was a gesture. Yeah. Obviously, there was no love between the two of them, and that comes up a little bit later as well. But yes. He puts it aside a couple days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, telling the president, whatever you need, we're behind you. Ford's at your disposal. Let's do this. It's modernizing it, but that's pretty much what he said.
Yeah. So in Detroit, Detroit, in 1939, was it still feeling the effects of the Depression?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. The Depression, for most part of the 30s, unemployment is somewhere in the teens, 16%, 18%, 20%. The safe way to put it is, even though the auto companies had geared up prior to Pearl Harbor, unemployment was still pretty high and wages were pretty low, and it was a rough scene. And in spite of that, there were still problems getting enough people into the war factories pre-war, and then even not too long after that. So yeah, there was labor unrest. There were some racial issues. It was not a nice, clean thing that you kind of see where, by December 8th of 41, everybody's out in the street shaking hands. We're going to march off to victory. That really wasn't the case. There were all kinds of labor concerns and labor problems. The other automotive companies, Dodge, Packard, Studebaker, Chrysler, had already geared up and were slowly ramping up towards being more efficient and hiring more people, but it was kind of a slow process to get that done and to get out of the Depression, which is ultimately, any first-year history student will tell you that World War II ended the Great Depression. Yeah. And that is 100% true. We now have millions of men and women in the military. These plants are going night and day, and pretty much any kind of industry, and including agriculture, just is absolutely required. They need people and bodies, and the country mobilizes behind FDR. Whether you're a Republican, Democrat, it doesn't really matter. I think it is safe to say that whether you agreed with him or not, President Roosevelt did an amazing job kind of guiding the country through the early stages of the war.
Yeah. I saw a picture of the Detroit streets, maybe it was the mid to late 30s, and there seemed to be an awful lot of cars on the streets and that kind of thing. It seemed it was a kind of a bustling city, but at the same time you're saying it was still kind of in the midst of the Depression. So where were all these cars? who was buying all these cars?
Well, auto sales did kind of tank a little bit, and people were holding on to their cars probably longer than they would have in other circumstances. Yeah, Detroit has had that reputation, and you talk to some relatives, grandparents or great grandparents, and downtown Detroit was the place to go. The Hudson Building and the train station, which is now back and better than ever. There were still people down there, but I think that doesn't necessarily represent the common man, the everyday man. The country was kind of in a really bad way, but there were still enough people out driving around, going to ball games, that sort of thing.
I see. Okay, so we've got the plant. I think Roosevelt came out and visited the plant, right?
Yes, he did.
So what year was that?
President Roosevelt came out to Willow Run in September of 1942, and it was part of a travel schedule that he had. He wanted to do it kind of as a publicity thing, but there was also an aspect of, I want to go in there, see what's going on. What did my $200 million, $400 million buy me? And so he comes and takes a tour of the plant. There's a very famous photograph, and also Sorensen talks about it in his book, The Day That FDR Visits. They had a nice, a particular convertible car just that would help him get around. Yeah. Still, again, even in 42, the majority of people didn't know that he was
crippled. Right?
Yeah, crippled and wheelchair bound. And so they have a convertible, and they're going to drive it through the factory. The factory's unbelievably large. It's not going to be a problem to drive a car through there. I believe that Sorensen and Edsel may have conspired to do this, but in the back seat of the convertible, we have FDR, and then in the middle, they put Henry Ford, and next to him, they put Eleanor Roosevelt. So that's your back seat, and then the front seat, there was a driver, there was Edsel, and then there was Sorensen. And the picture that is out there still exists, shows, you can't see everybody, but it shows a picture of Henry Ford right next to President Roosevelt, and it looks like he would rather be having dental surgery or anything else that you could imagine. It was not a pleasant time for him. Again, they kind of buried the hatchet a little bit, but they weren't going to ever completely bury it. So they take a tour of the factory, and at the end, there's pictures, and we're talking about it, and we're making speeches, and this is the future, and everything's great here, and it's kind of really a positive thing outwardly, but FDR is asking, what is going on? Why aren't you turning out airplanes? Keeping in mind that by that visit in 42, the plant really had been around for only about 16 months, 18 months, and it just was not really humming along yet. They had produced one or two airplanes. The quality of those airplanes were very suspect, and they were not ready to go into mass production. Fast forward a couple months, and the next famous visitor that comes along to the plant is a fellow named Senator Harry Truman. He is in charge of the Truman Commission, which was looking into wartime waste and to see if there was any corruption or any money to be saved for the federal government, all these billions that are being doled out all over the place. So February of 43, Truman comes out and takes a tour of the plant as well. Edsel pretty much pulls him aside and pulls him into the office at the end of the tour and says, look, this is why. I can show you. He's got charts, he's got graphs, he's got stacks of paper to show Truman what the problems were in the plant. And kind of in his own, Edsel's own words, the number one problem was absenteeism and keeping employees in the factory. They would train, in the end, they trained like over 50,000 people on the grounds to do the job, but they would train 1,000 people 1 week, and then a couple weeks later, most of them didn't show up. They were gone. Some of the problems inside of absenteeism was a lot of the people that came up here from Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, and some of the other states that fed into the war machine up here, they couldn't find a place to live. Yeah. There was no no housing near the plant, no infrastructure. There are a number of recorded like letters back home of people saying that I'm coming back home. The job's good, the pay is good, all of that, but there's no place for me to live. Some people lived in their cars for a while. Some people lived in kind of smaller and not that great, like a travel trailer or a camping trailer. That was a problem. There was like a tent city that's going on. They just didn't have the infrastructure. So that is a problem that Edsel puts to Truman, saying, help me out with this. Give me some money, give us something, come out here. Eventually they put up what Roosevelt had called Bomber City, and it was a series of quick, cheap apartments, individual houses. I'm not going to say condos, that gives the wrong idea. But they start building some things in the area out here to house these people and to offer them something. They also built some makeshift stores. They built doctor's offices. They tried to put together theaters for when they weren't working to make it a little more pleasant out here. That happened, that started in around 43, and around $50 million of federal money was put towards that to make it livable and to make it something that could be done here.
But none of that is left anymore, is that correct?
Correct. No, most of that, and again, and a lot of them were just like plywood and tar paper walls and things. There are plenty of stories about how bad those places were, that you could hear your neighbor next door above. Yeah. The plumbing was usually substandard in the wintertime. The windows barely worked. It was not that great. They were really rough living conditions as far as that went. Other issues that happened as far as why the plant was not as productive as soon as it could be. Within Michigan itself, there was something called the War Manpower Commission. Actually, that was nationally, but there were local offices. War Manpower Commission. It was in 42 an attempt to kind of spread out the available manpower between the different industries that were here in Michigan. And Detroit sometimes competed with Muskegon. Muskegon had a number of war industry plants over there as well. There were some foundries that were building tank parts and some other things over there.
Well, we should explain to the audience where Muskegon is. Oh. They might not know.
I'm terribly sorry. It's a wonderful point. Muskegon is on the west side of Michigan. It is a couple hours north of Chicago once you get around the bend there in the lake, but it is over on Lake Michigan. Probably about a 3-hour drive from downtown Detroit.
It's kind of about halfway up between the southern border and Mackinac.
Yeah, exactly.
Up the coast.
Yeah, right? A lot of people, if you're coming from the west side of the southwest part of the state, Muskegon's kind of your halfway point maybe before you get to Traverse City or you get up to Mackinac City to go to the Upper Peninsula. But yes, Muskegon had a burgeoning war industry over there, and they were in competition with Detroit and with Willow Run for a number of bodies to get in the factory. Backing up, when Willow Run plant was designed, thought about, it was still peacetime. And the idea was that it was eventually going to employ about 100,000 workers. And at the time, again, the Depression, the area between Ann Arbor, between Detroit, Ypsilanti's right there as well, near the plant, they figured that they would have enough able-bodied men to work in this plant, upwards of 100,000, and that they were all going to be commuters. They were going to drive their cars into work, park at the factory, go in, build these planes, turn around and go home. When the plant is not exactly finished when the war starts, so now you're losing men that are drafted, you're losing men that are enlisting, you're losing men that kind of did what was called job shopping, and if I'm working today building airplanes at Willow Run, but I hear Packard is making rotary engines and they're paying 2 cents more an hour, or it's closer to my house, I'm going to go work there instead. So there was a lot of job hopping. The War Manpower Commission tried to put an end to that briefly. It was not successful, but they went so far as to try to set it up where if you're an able-bodied man, you actually had to get permission and a written document to change jobs. So you couldn't just do that. There was no teeth to it. There was no real penalty, and it didn't really work. But that was another effort to try to stabilize the employment pool and then try to get people where they were needed.
So how did they train all these people? That must have been a Herculean task too, right?
They did. On the grounds right adjacent to the factory, they set up a school. Mm-hmm. And within that school, they would teach people how to rivet. They would teach people how to weld. There were specific classes. I think there were over 100 different classes that they would be taught. They would bring people in and show them how the engines work, the inside of the engines, although they weren't built here, but it still had quite an effect on the production of the plane. They would show them the hydraulic system. So in a classroom setting, they had all of the pipes and tubes and things laid out that's going to represent the hydraulic system within the plane, and you wound up going to school. Most records indicate that if you were getting a job like a welder, you were in class on the grounds of the factory, getting paid as well.
Yeah.
But you were there probably about 4 weeks before you were transitioned from school into the factory to become a, again, whatever job it was you wound up doing. If you were riveting, if you were bucking, and that is the other behind the scenes part of the riveting process, you're holding the piece of steel that collapses and flattens the end of the rivet as it goes through. That's what's called bucking. If you're doing that, if you're welding, whatever else was going on in the factory, they had a class for you, and they physically taught you how to do it, and they paid you to learn how to do it.
Did they have men and women in the same class?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Absolutely. There's a number of publicity photographs showing just that, showing that men and women were right next to each other learning this, and then out on the factory floor, men and women were doing that. And as far as Ford is concerned, I can't speak to every one of the probably thousands of factories across the country during the war, but Ford at Willow Run was pretty revolutionary in that men and women worked side by side, and that women were paid the same as men.
Yeah.
That was not a normal thing in the United States, period. So they were making the same. And that was advertised. It was there are still existing posters asking or telling people to come get a job or asking them to come up to Michigan. And in the body of that poster, it says women paid the same as men.
Okay. So we have a few minutes left here. So let's now transition out. You know, they get the production up, they solve these problems, and then how do things wind down?
The easiest way to explain it is the end of the war in Europe, which ends May 8th of 1945. The remaining Nazis surrender, so the war ends there. Even before that, you could kind of see the writing on the wall in Europe. The Army starts canceling contracts for B-24s. They tell Ford, we don't need any more, and some of the future contracts that were coming up, they're canceled. And by the end of June 1945, Ford rolls out the very last B-24 Liberator here. Big ceremony was conducted, the last one that was built, and Henry Ford II is the one on the tractor driving it out of the factory. They had the people that were still here come up, I'm assuming with like grease pens or pencils or whatnot. They signed the fuselage of the last one, and that bomber became was put in a park as sort of a memorial to the men that flew them and the men and women that built them. The other part of it is, starting in 44 and in even 43, but 44 and into 1945, evolution of airplanes got to the B-24. The B-29 Super Fortress, which was designed and built by the Boeing Corporation, is light years ahead of anything else, including the B-24. It is pressurized. It has a much larger wingspan, a longer range. It has remote control guns that protect it. So you need, as far as that goes, you need a smaller number in the crew. And it pretty much did a much better job at heavy long-range bombing than the B-24. B-24 still was doing its job, and it was fine, but this is now the future, this airplane.
So would you say Lockheed was the one that made
the B-29?
Yeah, the B-29.
No, that was a Boeing product.
Boeing, yeah.
Same people that made the B-17, but again, this is like space age things compared to the other previous planes.
But did they take some of the techniques that were learned for the B-24 into manufacturing the B-29?
I believe it was more efficient. The B-29 had an early rough phase as far as training their pilots. The money that was put towards that is almost equal to the money that was put towards the Manhattan Project to develop the B-29. But yeah, Boeing Corporation has gotten a black eye the last few months, and the last year or two. But in 44, 45, they were on the top tier of airplane manufacturing. So I don't want to say exactly that they had an assembly line process like Ford did, because I don't know 100%. But yes, the B-29 is light years ahead of everything else, and really changed strategic long-range bombing at that point.
And that was the plane that was used for the nuclear bombing of Japan, right?
Yeah, August 6th, and then again on August 9th, B-29s dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah.
And chances are that, the B-24 would not have been suitable to carry out those bombings. So basically the B-24 outlives its usefulness. Last one's made in June of 45, and then the plant is slowly people kind of walk away from it. They clean it up, and for a little time after the war, they tried to produce what was called the C-87, which was a cargo version of the B-24. There were some of those made. It wasn't very successful, and again, plane and aviation evolution is going so fast at this point that the jet age is now here, things like that. So that was not very successful as far as the plant goes. Kaiser Frazer was a automobile manufacturing company. They built some Frazers there, Kaiser Frazers, there in the late 40s, early 50s. There's still people that drive those. They have clubs and things that love that car. That lasted for a while, but that was not really that successful like they had hoped it would be. And then eventually General Motors winds up taking over the plant, and in 20, 30-year time span at the factory, they wind up building something like 3 million transmissions for various GM products. So the factory itself had different lives throughout its existence, but you'd really have to say the heyday was churning out those B-24s.
Mm-hmm. And the building is essentially gone now, except for one little piece of it. Is that?
That is absolutely correct.
Yeah.
The building, again, in its heyday, was a little under 4 million square feet, and majority of it slowly was destroyed, taken out, knocked down as they were no longer using it. By 2010, I think the majority of it is gone. What is left is 144,000 square feet, and that part of the building is left. That is where the 90-degree turn had already happened, and then that building is where they had giant hangar doors. Once the planes were brought in, they would fuel the planes, add in oil, hydraulic fluid, things like that to the plane, and then open up another series of doors to let them out into the world. And then they would test fly the planes around southeastern Michigan for a couple hours, and then they were headed east or west, wherever they were needed for the war.
So did they fly them across the Atlantic, or were they shipped across the Atlantic?
Oh, no, they were absolutely flown across the Atlantic.
Okay.
For any airplane going to Europe, you had two choices. You had the northern route or the southern route. Northern route would take you to Canada, Greenland, Iceland if you needed to, then usually over to Scotland or England.
Yeah.
The southern route took you from Florida to Brazil, then across to friendly Morocco, and then up the coast to England. So those were your two routes to get the planes over there.
So did they have any crashes on the way there?
I don't know of any really famous ones, but you'd have to think so. Just mechanical issues, weather, anything like that. Because
they were new planes.
Well, exactly. And those planes were test flown around here when they came off the assembly line. Was a famous fellow named Charles Lindbergh. Yeah. And that would take another couple of podcasts to go through all of Lindbergh's things. But that was one of his jobs, was for about 2 years, he was here at the plant working, kind of consulting a little bit on the planes, but also he test flew the planes around southeastern Michigan. Really neat story. If you've got any scuba divers or divers in your family, one of the things they did was in these bombers, they loaded cement bombs. So bombs that were made out of cement, but they're shaped like it. They would load them into the plane to test that part of it, and they flew over Lake St. Clair, and they would drop the bombs into the lake. So even 80 years later, somewhere in the bottom of Lake St. Clair, there are cement bombs that were used to test the Liberators.
Oh, okay.
I think it'd be funny to find somebody, go down and get one, or put that as an exhibit at a museum.
That would be. Okay, Karl, I think we'll wrap it up here. We covered, again, a lot of territory. So, all right, and so we want to thank you very much. You know, this is quite informative, quite
it's my pleasure.
Revealing.
Get me talking, and sometimes it's hard to get me to stop. So.
Okay.
Sweet Mother Michigan, Father Superior, coming down from Mackinac and Sault Ste. Marie. Blue water Huron rolls down to Lake Erie, falls into Ontario and runs on out to sea. lakes are a diamond on the hand of North America, a bright shining jewel on that friendship bordering. It's a freshwater highway coming down from Canada, and all along the coastline you can hear the people sing, Sweet Mother Michigan, Father Superior, coming